Thank you. Thank you so much. And it's good to be back here. I spoke here last year too. And thanks so much for coming here after your lunch. I hope the talk will be exciting. The topic, I'm not really entertaining, but the topic will be interesting enough for you to keep you excited throughout the afternoon. Core rule set for the masses is about mod security, and especially its core rule set. Both are open source products from OWASP. And I'm gonna talk about how we tame these rules for a number of the clients that we have. And although the way that I was introduced, I work for a vendor, but we're gonna focus more on how you can use mod security, even if you choose to do that on your own. And this talk is really about from the practitioners to the practitioners, and to some of you who may be curious, about using mod security. And so these are kind of like the lessons that we have learned in using mod security. And our learning goals here are to understand mod security, and understanding mod security means setting right expectations about what you can get out of mod security, and in particular, but also in general, what you can get out of web application firewalls. And then we're gonna talk a lot about tuning, how to continuously care and feed your mod security setup. So here's a bit of an agenda, right? We talk about WAF in general, and then we talk about mod security in particular, and how you need to get ready both mentally and physically for getting started with WAF. And we're gonna talk about core rule set, how it is designed, talk about fine-tuning product process, and how we have done these safe exclusions, and how we tune these WAF profiles for our customers. And then we're gonna touch on core rule set 3.0, which is a fairly new release from OWASP. So I don't have a slide about myself, but I'll put it in perspective of where I come from. This is a bit of just one slide of what I do at work. Verizon gets into content delivery network business by purchasing this company called Edgecast, and that happened about 3.5 years ago. And today we run one of the largest content delivery networks in the world. Verizon touches about 60% of the internet traffic. We don't get to see all that. We touches about 5 to 7% of the internet traffic. But the internet traffic that we see is HTTP, and we can see through the encrypted packets, those over TLS, because we are a reverse proxy that can decrypt TLS. We are at TLS termination point. So from that vantage point, my team supports mod security firewall setup for a lot of our customers and clients, and from that perspective, I'm sharing these things that I have learned with you guys. So what is WAF? Just to have a level set about what WAF is about. So WAFs are firewalls, but they operate at the application level, right? So they're by definition the original, proxy firewalls, right? And the purpose of them is to address these web application security issues like OWASP top 10 risk, or any other risk that you might particularly have in your environment. And they can also operate at the network level information, like the IP addresses or geo country code and so on. But their primary purpose is to operate at the application level. So what are the benefits of using WAF? Right, so attack detection, right? So that's stating the obvious, right? So we, with WAF and the rules that we have, you can detect all the malicious traffic that are coming toward your web server before it reaches your web application. And if you can detect attack, you can do mitigation. And mitigation can be as simple as I'm not gonna do anything, but I'm gonna just log the fact that attacks are coming toward me, right? And I'll correlate later or so on. Or it could be downright block. I don't want this traffic, I'm gonna serve 403 a security violation like that. Or it could be anything in between, I'm gonna start redirecting it to a customer service page or something like that, so they can, if it is a legitimate customer, they have a chance to call or something. Even more useful use case of WAF is the virtual patching, right? So these days, we hear a lot about like framework breakages, like Struct and so on. And when the news gets out that there's a 0-day or your software has been updated, it takes time for you to actually patch your software, right? So WAF, by using the signatures to block the particular attacks that are exploiting that vulnerability, you can buy time. Sooner or later you will have to update your software, but WAF will give you protection sooner than you can update your software. And last but not least, you can also use it for policy enforcement, and that's like based on like, oh, I don't do business with North Korea or Iran and so on, so you can block requests from these countries based on geo IP locations. And also like, I don't run WordPress, or even if you run WordPress, I have no business or accessing this WordPress admin page from the internet. So you can block the URL using WAF. So even if you don't have WordPress, there are scanners and so on that people are trying to look for these WordPress login page, and your web server doesn't have to serve these requests, right? By blocking it at the WAF layer. And one more thing, which is WAF can be minimally useful in protecting against, what I call the automated threats to the web applications. And that's a project that I am co-leading with Colin Watson. WAFs are not specially designed to address these issues, but by what I call, those attacks by what I call dumb bots, like browsers without proper user agent, or they have different order of headers than they should, and things like that can be detected and mitigated by WAF. So, by the way, if you have any questions, you can raise your hand. I like that to be more interactive than just me talking, right? So, ModSecurity, a brief history about it. So, it's an open source application. It was started by Ivan Ristic, which, if you don't know his name, you probably know his product called the SSLLabs.com, right? So he started this project in 2002 and has evolved a lot since then. And originally, it was created as a plugin or a mod for Apache, hence the name. But it was later ported to Microsoft funded to port it to IIS, and also it was ported to Nginx, right? And it uses the language called the segrule. And segrule is a language that you write these signatures in. And basically, it's a combination of the regexes and like context-aware think about what kind of parameters, what cookies, or what elements in the HTTP request or the response that you want to detect. And the flexibility of that is like, it allows you to add your own signatures or people to contribute signatures to. So when ModSecurity started, it's like write your own rules type of thing. And later, we added, the core rule set was added. I believe it was called a community rule set, and it's now called core rule set, which is to be the default and the standard rule set for any ModSecurity-based WAF deployments. So when I say ModSecurity, there are actually two components, right? There's a ModSecurity engine, and there's a core rule set. And they are actually two different products and the projects in OWASP, right, and led by different people, and they are well coordinated, but they have their own release schedule. So by looking at that, the engine itself, the latest stable version is 2.9.2, and they have the RC1 release of the engine 3.0 out. But when you look at the core rule set, the current one, I believe, is at 3.02, and core rule set 3.0 came out like about a year ago. But there's a compatibility between core rule set 3.0 and engine 2.9.2. So if you're running, that's why they were able to release the core rule set version sooner than the engine version was ramped up. And they are connected but separate in that they are separate releases, and they're starting to have like separate goals. Like engine's purpose is to be efficient and effective in running in different environments. And also the core rule set's purpose is to detect a lot, but also take care of the false positives and so on. So we'll dive deep into that a little bit later. You can also deploy in multiple ways. The two common ways are you can embed it in the web server or web application server that you already have. So if you have like Nginx or Apache or IIS, it should just work out of the box. But also you can You can deploy that as a reverse proxy, like as a layer in front of your web farm or your web application server, right? And that way you can also make it more scalable in a way that, by using like the elastic infrastructure, like the cloud computing to auto scale, as your load grows. Or in our case, we deploy that inside our content delivery network, and content delivery networks auto scale by design. So that's designed to, that's a core feature of the content delivery networks. So by embedding a WAF inside that network, we get that scalability feature for free. So what are the design principles of ModSecurity, right? So it's designed to be flexible, right? So you can have the ModSecurity engine with no rules, and you can write all your rules, right? If you choose to do that, and I've heard and seen people doing that. And you can do like either positive security model or negative security model or both, right? So positive security model is like defining these URLs only take these values for these parameters. You can define them in sec rule language, and you can run that. And anything that is out of range or out of bound with these values, either it'll be flagged or it'll be blocked. But also you can run it in the negative security model, meaning that it looks for malicious patterns of patterns in the web traffic, and core rule set is about negative security model. The other principle about ModSecurity is passiveness. So unless you tell it to like block, it doesn't block. It'll log it. It'll give you information. So it gives you ability to do what you want with these malicious or suspicious traffic. And then last but not least, and the thing I like most about ModSecurity principle is the predictability, right? Meaning that when you run ModSecurity with a rule or a rule, it behaves just the same way as today and tomorrow and so on, right? It's because the regexes just work the same way, so it doesn't change the behavior of WAF doesn't change with just because you release a new software or you have a different pattern of traffic that coming in that day. And I think that's a really important and underappreciated issue because if we can tell that if we can make every software program to be predictable, we will have a lot less security issues. So how do we use ModSecurity? What are the capabilities, right? One is monitoring, but that's kind of like pointing the obvious. You have this ModSecurity WAF running. Of course, you're gonna monitor things, but it can also be used and sometimes abused as a full HTTP logging, because your web server logs usually don't contain the parameters and the content of the payload. It contains like headers and cookies and so on. But if you really want to do more logging, ModSecurity is a great way to do that. It is not cheap. It'll be expensive in both having to process that and to log it. But if you want some visibility, especially when some situation triggers, logging is a good use case. Obviously, attack detection and mitigation. Once you can detect attack, you can choose how to respond to that. And virtual patching, as I discussed earlier, it buys you time, basically. And virtual patching can be for your own vulnerability, like the vulnerability that is specific to your code, or the vulnerability in the frameworks, right? And there are a lot of security scanners that incorporate ModSecurity language as an output. Like when they find a certain vulnerability in your application, they can produce a sec rule language filter criteria, and you can ingest that into your ModSecurity setup, so you can get that patch from day one, and you can buy your time to have it fixed properly. And access control, like blacklisting, whitelisting URLs, the use case that I mentioned earlier about WordPress, or it could be the certain blocks of IP addresses that you don't want to do business with. It could be the cloud provider, right? So you may choose to not do business with AWS related IP addresses because most consumers don't use AWS to browse their to browse the web, right? And Another thing that is kind of overlooked with WAF and especially ModSecurity is how you can use it to reduce the attack surface by whitelisting, blacklisting certain type of HTTP verbs. Like you probably don't want profile or options or delete out and open to the internet. And by the same time, you can put limits on how about the parameter size and maximum file size that you can upload and so on. So you can apply these controls, and especially if you have multiple applications behind your load balancer or your vanity URL, and you have either a reverse proxy setup, either in-house or CDN or cloud, you can have a centralized point in controlling what your attack surface. It does come with some price, you have to think about performance when you use that, because vendors may tell you their firewall is free of performance penalty, but that's not true, because once you start doing these comparison, matching regexes and so on, that's going to be some performance hit, and we want that to be low, and we want that to be consistent across as your load grows. Right, so there are some activities that are more performance intensive than others, like file scans, for example. For external operation, that anything that has to make a call out to a different system to have a decision made, or there's some rules are more noisy than others. We'll get into that in details. And if you're gonna use or abuse this ModSecurity feature of full HTTP logging, and depending on how you use it, it could generate a lot of logs, and it could bog down your logging systems and so on. Right, and you have to take care of false positives. It is getting better, and especially with 3.0 rule set, it should be almost plug and play, but we'll get into more of that. And it has to scale linearly, so that's a really important point that I want to make. If you're gonna do ModSecurity on your own, is when you have more load, you want to have the consistent performance hit. You have to pay a little bit of you'll pay a little bit of performance penalty, but you want that to be consistent whether you have 100 requests per second or 1,000 requests per second. So this graph is from ModSecurity Handbook, written by Christian Follini and Ivan Ristic, and they did some performance analysis, and the green one, I believe you want to pay attention to the yellow one here, which is core rule set with a paranoia level 1, which is a very finely tuned rule set, right? But even with that, once you get beyond certain point, you start to pay the performance penalty. So a good way to set this up is to have an auto-scaling architecture, right? So if you're using either cloud or in a CDN, you get the auto-scaling architecture for free. But if you're using, doing it on your own, you want to somehow, allocate more reverse when your load increases. But there are some limitations, whether you use ModSecurity or any other WAF, it is not one box to fix them all, right? I think a lot of people in this room know that, but if somebody tells you otherwise, it's not true. It is also not set it and forget it, right? Although the rules are getting better and we pay a lot of attention to these false positives and so on, it does require KM maintenance, and it could be monthly or it could be weekly, depending on how dynamic your environment is. Right, it is definitely not a replacement for other secure development practices and tools like threat modeling. WAF doesn't know your intentions. WAF doesn't know about features being abused, or there's a logic in your code that it just doesn't know that. It is not risk-free. You have to manage, you have to find a balance between false positives and false negatives. And even with the open source, there's going to be a cost for hardware and some KN maintenance. But WAFs are becoming essential, right? So the collective thinking in the OWASP community is that in the beginning, we don't need WAF if we do all the software development, secure software development practices right, but then thinking started to shift, we can do all the SDLC right, but if there's a framework breakage and there's a bug in our code, WAF will buy you time, right? From that to now today, I used David Casey's presentation slide with his permission, basically he is saying that webs are essential, right? If you want to have a secure web deployment architecture, web should be part of it. And part of that is because even if your application is solid, the frameworks tend to break from time to time. And even the frameworks don't break, even if you have the frameworks up to date, people are still going to attack your website. And even if your application or the framework is not vulnerable, you still have to deal with these attacks, and it can have performance implications to your application. So for that, just blocking the unwanted traffic, defining and blocking that before it gets to your web application is a valuable component in your architecture. So this is about WAF and ModSecurity in particular, but how do you get prepared? How do you get ready for using this, right? So this almost sounds like I copied that from a fortune cookie or master son out of war, but it's about knowing. It's about knowing yourself. It's about knowing your risk and what kind of adversary you're facing, and it's about knowing your environment, like what application you're using, what is the acceptable behavior of your web application. Are these developers still around? Things like that, right? But knowing yourself, based on our experience, different businesses have different risks, right? If you're an e-commerce company, performance is important, but also low false positive rate is important, right? So they will rather not lose a sale, but they will then having some unwanted traffic go through. So for them, and when we fine tune them, when we work with them, keeping the false positive really low is really important. It's very different when you work with a publisher like an online magazine or online news. They're more concerned about availability of their website, right? So even if they have to be stricter about security settings, if they have to block some what could be like a legitimate traffic, if they can keep their website up and running, that's more important, especially that if they have attackers who are attacking based on the ideology of the editorial position that their publication takes. Banks may be more concerned about data loss, like in inspecting the outbound traffic. So if you see like a large number of data or some credit card patterns going outbound, like in the HTTP responses, they may care more about that, right? And availability is one of the concerns that a lot of our clients have, and some of them have like, my downtime is worth $1 million an hour or something, right? So for them, keeping the up and running is critical. And what about compliance, right? Does it comply with PCI? Yeah, sure, but what about like other compliance requirements that you internally may have, right? And the bottom line question that we usually ask is like how much, security, overall security posture that it improves. And also knowing yourself means that, if you have to balance between false positive and false negative, which side you're gonna err on? And it usually depends on what, your organization's aptitude, taste and risk, and also, what kind of business you are in, going back to the point number one. And then we kind of lead them into these questions about, who has attacked you, what are the security concerns or incidents that you might have, you have had in the past, and whatever they can share with us. Sometimes their competitors scraping their website is a concern for them, although that's not directly WAF's job. You can use WAF to control some of that, like these are automated scrapers that are running and scraping their prices and so on. And knowing your environment, really important. What is your technology stack? What is the web app behavior that you desire, right? What is the do you know the maximum size of the file that you want to allow to upload? Or what are the size of parameters and so on? What HTTP methods? What file extension you don't want to serve? What is your network architecture like? And do you still know who the developers are? And we do need to ask them questions from time to time. So, if they get to come to us on a phone call, that's great. But even if they cannot, if we have like a way to reach to them and get our questions answered, that helps us a lot in understanding, whether it is safe to whitelist a cookie or not. And, how do you want to block it? If you once you find something malicious, do you want to outright block it or redirect it to another page, or you want a pretty logo or not? One of the hardest things I have seen, especially with people deploying our product and not using it, although they may be paying for it. It's like they just abandon because there are too many alerts, right? And that's because they don't do the fine tuning right, and our service doesn't come as a standard, and sometimes they choose not to. But you can do that on your own. We're happy to give them tutorial and so on. But a lot of times, when people don't work with us, they ended up, a few of them ended up, just turning the WAF in alerting mode and don't do anything with these alerts. And that's not good for anyone because they're paying, but they're not getting the value out of it. But also, for us, like we a lot of alerts are piled up on our systems, and they have no value to anyone. And out of the box settings usually don't work. We're trying to get better with these settings, and also core root set is trying to get better with the default settings. But at some point you have to look at them and you have to make some adjustment, right? So getting to core root set, it's basically a template to get you started, right? It's not the end state that you want to be in, but it's the beginning of your process of using WAF, right? And its goal is to address the issues that are defined in OWASP Top 10. That list is changing, so I think that will have to be re-evaluated somehow. But things like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, remote file access, accessing information leakage like .ini file or configuration files and so on, right? So these are the standard part of the rule set, and it is regex based. It's written in a language called the ModSec rule, and it's basically the default setup that you get today with ModSecurity. But once you get that running, you have to fine tune it. And here's the holy grail of fine tuning. This is based on the real data, and we were getting about 450 million alerts a month, and by tuning it over months, and these on the horizontal axis are months here, we get to between 1 or 2 million alerts a month, and that's for both alerting and blocking. So the goal about fine tuning is to teach WAF so that it can make the right decisions on your behalf. In other words, it can make the kind of decisions that you want it to make, right? Because and this is our template. This is our process of really run that in alert mode for at least a week, right? And a week is necessary because your traffic pattern varies based on day of the week. Couple of weeks or a month would be better if you have the luxury. A month is good, but it's not necessary. But you start identifying the false positives. There are some things that are easier to spot than others, and you correct these fields as needed, right? And you have to decide what to do with the false positive, because the first thing you're gonna run into is a lot of false positives. So what do I want to do with the false positives? Do I want to disable the rule? We don't recommend that as a first step, and we'll go through how you fine tune it. So one of the features of the ModSecurity and core rule set is the anomaly scoring. So I'm gonna skip to this table. I'm gonna explain this. So in our setup, we can run two different profiles here, two different settings, if you will, about for each incoming HTTP request. So one is, so you can run one in blocking mode and the other in alerting mode. But so this is for the same HTTP request that comes in, and each of the profile has what we call the anomaly threshold, right? So HTTP request comes in, and the first rule applies to that, and it violates the rule, and it adds, it attributes a score to the incoming HTTP request, right? Then another rule gets applied, and it'll add more score, and it'll add more score, and when it reaches or exceeds the threshold that you have set up here, in the lower line it is 10, and when that reaches 11, the 11 is greater than 10, and it'll issue an alert, right? But the inspection will go on, and it'll see like, oh, the next rule gets applied, and then it's going to attend to the anomaly score, and then now it becomes 21, which is greater than 15, and in that case, it's going to take blocking action on this. Right, so this is the way to reduce the false positive, because some rules are meant to support others, and they work together to make sure to determine whether the request is malicious or not. Right. So the balance here is that if you have the higher threshold, you have you have more false positives. If you have lower threshold, let me say it again. If you have higher threshold, you have more false negative, and if you have lower threshold, you have more false positive. It's about finding the balance. And the goal is to keep that threshold to be at the minimum with acceptable rate of false positives, and that depends on your business and your environment. And with any firewall, right, starting with the network firewall, once you have set up the firewall, the next thing you do is to punch holes, right? But here, what I like to tell here is don't blow too many holes, right? The more holes you open, the weaker security posture that you have. But for you to make it work, you need to punch a few holes here. But you want to be as precise as possible when you do that, so that you don't open up too much. So we start with excluding the variables, right, from particular rules, and we could go like excluding some variables and cookies from either particular rules or all rules, and we will use we will disable the rule as a last resort if we have to. And there are some rules that just don't belong there, and especially with core rules set prior to 3.0, there are some rules like a list here, 981172 and 73. They look for special characters in the HTTP request, and they can be pretty noisy. So these rules are usually safe to turn off. We know that through experience, and we kind of share notes with other ModSecurity practitioners, and they tend to agree with that. And CRS 3.0 takes care of that a lot better. So here's one of the examples of how you do the exclusion. Right, this ModSecurity has this method called the set rule update target by ID. So what you do is that you specify the ID of the rule number that you want its behavior to change, and then you put if the argument equals, don't inspect the arguments, the value of the arguments in email by this rule. Right, so this is based on one of the exercises that we did. What that means is that I think it was looking for something like the special characters, but email contains @ sign and so on. So it just wasn't wise to inspect email parameter with that rule. We often runs into this issue of the cookies containing these delimiters and special characters to basically special characters to serve as the delimiters to contain your preferred store, or your click history, or different things that it wants to put in the cookies, and cookies tend to trigger a lot of these false positives. So depending on the cookie, a lot of times we try to exclude these cookies from being inspected by particular rules, but sometimes these cookies have to be ignored altogether. But the trick here is that before you do that, you work with the developers, or at least developers representatives, to make sure that the cookie is used in a safe way. Like there's no possibility of SQL injection getting through that cookie, and it will be used in an unsafe way later. All right. So with that, CRS 3.0, which is really good for us because it takes care of a lot of these issues that we spend a lot of laborious time and effort on. Right. So CRS 3.0, it's long overdue in my opinion. Right. The last thing we updated to the last update to 2.2.9, which was one version before 3.0, was done in 2013, and 3 years later, we 3.0 was released. I believe that was November. They announced it like around AppSec USA last year, but I think there was an RC1 or RC2, and it became final like around end of the year or beginning of this year. What they introduced here is the paranoia mode, right? So we'll explain that in details, but paranoia mode basically is another way to reduce the false positives in addition to the anomaly scoring that we have used. And they actually removed some of the problematic rules, like the infamous one that I showed earlier. Some of them are gone, and they're actively working on, and that's where you can contribute, right? If you have any issues with using ModSecurity 3.0, you can open a GitHub issue, and we will take a look at it. We meaning, Robert, who helped me with these slides, is part of the team, and the goal of this is to have false positive free and paranoia level 1. The other changes that they have made is now used as a live injection library. So what that means is that when you set up ModSecurity on your own, especially with earlier engine, you need to have the live injection library, and it makes the SQL injection and cross-site scripting type of detection a lot more efficient to detect. And people are contributing a lot of documentation as well. And there's a book I mentioned earlier, that's pretty much a very good guide in having you getting and running ModSecurity. So what is paranoia mode? Right, so paranoia mode is related to anomaly scoring mode in that they have the same goal, but they work differently. Right, so with the core rule set 3.0, there are 4 different paranoia modes. So paranoia level 1 is, something that something that the goal of that is for you to start using it and not to worry about false positives. There may be a few false positives, depending on how your software is written, but it has about 150 rules that are really solid, and we're actively working on improving that. If you have, legitimate false positive issue, please open a GitHub issue. And then you get 30 more rules when you go to level 2, and that's like, I think most organizations may fall into this, or well, not most, but if you have a strong security culture, you will fall into that. Most organizations will fall into just level 1, and that's a goal. But like banks, or or this website has been subject to a number of attacks in the past, and you need more rules. You have 30 more rules, and with more rules, it'll come more possibility of false positive. At level 3, you get 15 more. At level 4, you get 6 more, but these are problematic ones. And if you're gonna go that, and some of the examples that it was used is like if you're running like a nuclear power plant or military base or something. These are made up examples, but I think in my mind, being a practitioner, I wouldn't recommend anyone at paranoia level 4, right? If you really want to be paranoid, stay at level 3. Make sure it's fine-tuned and all that. But most of the times, you'll be either level 1 or level 2. Any questions so far? These are a few other areas, not just core rule set. You can do access control, like I said earlier, based on geolocation or URLs, or use settings to do stricter policy, and with 3.0, there's a rudimentary rate limiting feature. There's a honeypot version features. A penalty box is the rate limiting feature. Virtual patching. We're working on this idea of having a community repository of these virtual patching rules, like when struck or some issue comes out, people can start contributing their own rules, and we'll triage it and make it available. We meaning the ModSecurity core rule set project. Yeah, so if you don't have any questions, thanks for your time. But if you have any questions, yeah, please. Yeah, James.
Yeah, the project you're working
Automated threats? Automated threats to web applications.
Yeah, I was just asking about the project working on with Colin Watson. You said is automated threats to web applications.
Correct.
Is that a OWASP project? Or?
Yes, it is an OWASP project. We just published version 1.1 of the book, and next month we're gonna publish 1.2. And it catalogs 20 different threats. It's gonna be 21 different threats that are common to web applications. But these are abuse of features like login page or gift card cracking and things like that.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. That's great.
Yeah, I gave a talk about that here last year. Does any of you guys use ModSecurity in one way or the other through the vendor or Josh? Okay. I mean, any other comment you want to make will be welcome, or any more questions? All right. Well, thanks for your. Oh yeah, Josh.
Hey Tin, thanks for the talk. So when we were working on implementing ModSecurity, we were doing it for a very specific project. And one of the challenges that we came across here was that the application, it was really hard to limit the inputs because it effectively took everything. Take a username as an example. If I wanted to do any validation on the field, it was like, this username could have Japanese characters, or it could have, single quotes in it because it could be in Ireland, and all these different things. Do you have any tips for people who want to do like input validation with ModSecurity, but you're challenged in that way, right? The inputs could effectively be the whatever.
Yeah. So, what I have seen is that, if you want to be liberal about controlling input or restricting input at the WAF layer, you have to be conservative about how you use the input at the application layer. So that's a rule that we use when we fine tune it, right? If we're gonna whitelist a cookie or exclude a cookie, then we make sure with the developers that the cookie is not used in a malicious, in a dangerous way. They may say that, but but at that point they take their risk. Any other questions? If not, well, yes. Sorry, I couldn't see you.
It sounds like Verizon is offering. It sounds like. It sounds like Verizon is offering ModSecurity like a WAF SaaS kind of deal.
Yes.
Is that accurate?
Correct.
So we use Encapsula. Obviously, there's another platform that does this. What are some other? Do you know of any other SaaS offerings in the WAF space?
Yeah. So every CDN provider has some kind of WAF offering, and they all started with ModSecurity, and some of them diverge away from ModSecurity and they do their own, or they may say like they do their own. Which in some cases it's true that they have forked away from that, but for us, we decided to stay with ModSecurity with the open source type, and if we have to make this better, we'll contribute that to the open source, and we work with the community. And there are others in that camp, competitors in this camp as well.
Thanks.
Quick question. I spent an awful lot of time evaluating WAFs some years back, and sat through a number of presentations by a number of vendors that basically said WAFs were dead. And there's lots of issues around blacklisting and whitelisting false positives. What do you think of some of the more advanced WAF technologies? Someone had mentioned what's out there. There's technologies that offer what I would call CDN-based WAFs that create replica grids, and they're very good in terms of very tuned rules, zero false positives. Right? What they do is they basically push push out the traffic to a proxy front end, so to speak. They're called CDN. I basically call them CDN-based WAFs. Have you? One used to be one's Trusted Night, one's Cloud DMZ. For me, those make a lot more sense than having to deal with the tremendous amount of rules that we used to have to write in Imperva, and the false positives. It just seems to me to make a lot more sense to have these replica grids in front of your application.
Yeah, so to comment on that, WAF is dead. I don't think so, but you have to see WAF as a mechanism to limit the traffic or control the traffic that you don't like far away from your precious compute resources, whether they are in the core cloud or the your data center. And things like CDNs are like edge cloud, right? So it's a part of the cloud, but it runs closer to the user and has better scalability than your core cloud infrastructure. So defining the criteria that you want to limit at the edge has a lot of advantages, right? That's how I see it. You always have issue of false positives and false negatives. It's a matter of continuously learning and tuning, and some products, do that like through AI or whatever the fancy words these days are used.
And one last question. I noticed a small number of rules in the environments that I've been involved in, where the applications were the DevOps environment. These applications were the release cycles were very, very rapid. So it was, if not extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, to have a tight whitelist and get out of learning mode. We were relegated to a blacklist, and so 20, 30,000 rules at some of these folks, some of the companies I was working with Imperva. So how does that compare to the rule sets that you're talking about here? Much less rules.
Well, 20 to 30,000 rules is a lot to manage. When we designed this, we went through the list. We look at core rule set, we look at trustworthy rule set. We wrote some of the rules on our own, and we trimmed it down to like 2,000. And that's everything we have in our universe that covers like, WordPress and Joomla and OS Commerce and so on. But that's still a bit too large to manage. If you're gonna whitelist, yeah, you're gonna need more rules. And in terms of like DevOps environment, these things have to be automated. I hope that whatever product you're using will have an API that you can plug into the DevOps environment, and whenever there's a change needed, call that API and have that change made, right? You're gonna still need some human review, but at least you get it done and review that.
Thank you.
Any other?
You mentioned learning mode in kind of like a week or whatever. Well, when you're like in an Agile or a DevOps shop and you're pushing, once a day, 10 times a day, how does that affect? Do you see people kind of wrestling with that problem?
Yeah, that's a good question. Learning mode a week, I think, will be required regardless of whether you use the machine to do the analysis or you do the analysis manually. We have some clients who come in like, we want the protection from day one. We don't have a week to learn, which is fine. It's sometimes it is necessary if you're like under attack or you're like a target-rich environment. What we do is like would you accept the false positive, right? We do it tight since day one, or we'll just go with the really tight rules, safe, rules, and then we'll expand that blocking profile later, right? All right. Well, thank you so much for having me here. Appreciate your time.